Hello, everybody. It's an absolute pleasure to be here in Berlin. My name's Anna Edwards. I work for Bloomberg News and Bloomberg TV, and also as acting London bureau chief. So it's a pleasure to be here in Germany, in Berlin, with all of you for this Global Solutions Summit. And it's a real pleasure to be hosting this conversation, to be moderating this conversation with Anshoola Kant, Managing Director and CFO at the World Bank, and Nathalie Delapalme, CEO of the Mo Ibrahim Foundation, which provides an African voice on global challenges. And we certainly heard a lot there from Chancellor Scholz about the global challenges we face. He took issue with the idea of there being just one crisis and took us back to the idea of polycrises, which is a good place to start our conversation, because we wanted to talk about financial architecture, and we heard some of this from Chancellor Scholz as well, about whether we have the right financial architecture, the right players playing the right role to the right extent to fix the world's problems, to solve these polycrises. So maybe we'll start there, and I'll start with you, Anshoola. So if we take a step back, give us your thoughts on why we need change to the financial architecture, by which we're talking about all the players and the parts of that financial architecture that have been in place since after the Second World War. Why do you think that we need to see that reshaped?
Thank you, firstly, Anna. Very good to meet you and Nathalie through this panel. And it was very interesting the way Chancellor Scholz set up the context for this discussion. And, you know, he was spot on when he said that we are living in a world of polycrisis. There's climate change impact, there is war and conflict, and there is this huge debt burden which the low-income countries are facing today. And there are many other things, but, you know, and I like the question he posed, where do we start? And on the back of the question, I think it's the time for us to ask, and this is a good question that you've asked, what are we doing right? There are many things we are doing right, and what are we doing things which can improve? So first, you know, before I go into saying what needs to change, what doesn't, but let me just say from the World Bank, what are we trying to do? The scale of the problem needs all players on deck. We all need to be in this together. No one entity can do this alone. So our first focus is, of course, we follow a country-driven model where the countries are in the driver's seat. So we are trying to work with countries to help them in some ways help themselves. The Chancellor talked about taxation. I'm talking about domestic resource mobilization. I'm talking about better public finance management, better prioritization of the challenges, and we help them do all of this through our knowledge, through our analytic support, and through the financing that we do. So they are in the driver's seat. We support them in what they want to achieve as their development priorities. And the second aspect is, of course, working much better with other development partners, other MDBs, other bilateral development partners. There is this challenge which countries face, the recipient countries face, in terms of multiplicity of players. So there's fragmentation, there is transaction cost for the receiving countries. So we are, at least, you know, as a giant first step, trying to work much better with the MDBs. We've set up a co-financing platform. We announced it at the spring meetings last month, whereby all MDBs who are participating, and I'm happy to say that 10 have agreed to participate in this.
Okay.
We put the larger projects that need co-financing from each other on this platform so that we have an early visibility, there's transparency of sharing information, and we speak as one voice when we go to the country who needs this financing for their national programs.
Okay.
And then the third thing, it was interesting to hear Chancellor mention the private sector and how the private sector financing and funding and resources are needed, because there is where the big resources rest. So we started this private sector investment lab, and through the ideas that were generated meeting and talking to these CEOs, what came forth is that we have very good guarantee instruments which can de-risk private sector investment and facilitate. But it's a little bit of a challenge for outsiders to access which instrument, which guarantee, which entity within the World Bank Group. So we have created a unified guarantee platform which will be launched from the 1st of July this year, and it'll be housed at MIGA. So all guarantee products across the World Bank Group, whether they are IBRD, IDA, IFC, or MIGA, they will be housed in one place. the teams are it's like a one-stop shop. So it becomes more fit for purpose, suitable for our own teams as well as countries and other private sector players who want to access this.
Okay. So that's quite a lot about what's going right, and we'll touch on some of that, and we'll also come back to this idea of what needs reshaping in the financial architecture. Natalie, from the perspective of the Mo Ibrahim Foundation, what are your thoughts on why we need to have a conversation about reshaping the financial architecture?
I think that in order to see whether the current system is still fit for purpose, we need to have a look on what are the needs and what are the current supply, and indeed to make the point that it doesn't fit. When we look at the needs, 3 points maybe. The first is we're very far from reaching the development goals, be it the SDGs or Agenda 2063 for Africa. And even more, I think we're going backwards somehow. If we look at SDGs, only 2 out of the 17 SDGs are satisfactory for Africa, and the very worst performing are zero hunger and global health and well-being. If we look at Agenda 2063, the last assessment that has been made of the first 10-year implementation plan assesses that only 20% of the goals have been achieved. The second point is there is a rather mind-boggling multiplicity of numbers about the needs that are difficult to be frank to understand, but they all point to staggering levels of needs. I mean, currently achieving SDGs in Africa, it's between 13 trillion and 20 trillion, so quite a number. Climate, currently, we still have first a loss of probably between 3% and 15% of GDP when it comes to Africa. We need 3 trillion to fulfill Africa's NDCs by 2030. And in 2022, climate finance for Africa is barely covering 10% of the needs. The third point is that there is a key concern for Africa to see the current focus on climate conversation, climate policies, climate finance, overcrowding the need for development. And this is really something that we must address. I'll take 2 points. Conversation about climate is about energy transition. In a continent where half the population still doesn't have access to energy, it's not easy to understand. I'll take another thing. Climate policy focus, for the time being, seems to me still to be mostly defined by already developed countries, which means that the focus is on mitigation rather than adaptation. So we need to sort of refocus or change a little bit the needle and make sure that we are able to reconcile climate and development, or to put it as the last Paris summit on Paris Pact for Planet and People, make sure that no country has to choose between solving poverty at home and saving the planet. This is really something important. When we look at the supply now, very quickly, and I can come back on that, we have 2 things. We have external supply. I'll take 2 examples. External supply, ODA to Africa. ODA to Africa represents about 10% of the continent's total financial resources. It's still mainly coming from ODA, from the OECD DAC countries and from the multilateral current system, but this is going down. And we see the non-DAC country partners, and it's important to see that they call themselves partners and not donors, that are growing up and investing sectors that the current ODA donors don't go to. Education and health still are the main priorities of DAC donors, whereas these new partners go into infrastructure, debt, agriculture, digital, and whatever. Even if I know that the World Bank is doing much more on this new topic. Debt is the key challenge in Africa. I mean, it has tripled since 2009. But the main issue on debt is less the volume than the structure. I mean, if we look at the structure of debt, it has gone from less than 25% was owned by private creditors in 2009. Now it's over 43%, which makes, of course, all the current operation around restructuration of debt much more difficult. Something that the Paris Club is almost obsolete now. And the second point for debt is borrowing costs, which are staggering when it comes to Africa. And there we come to something that many consider the elephant in the room. It's African risk assessment and African risk coverage, because this is also a key hurdle when it comes to foreign direct investment and foreign portfolio investment, which must also contribute to financing development and climate needs. On supply, a last point, which is we need to consider not only external supply, but the potential African supply. And there we have several points to address, and the Chancellor himself talked about it. The first one is about making sure that we are preventing leakages from illicit financial flows. Currently, the amount of illicit financial flows is assessed as probably as much, if not more, as the annual average of ODA or African remittances. Strengthening the tax systems, this has already been mentioned, just a figure. Currently, Africa is losing on average 27 billion a year of potential corporate tax revenue through profit shifting. 3, leveraging African remittances, African sovereign funds, African potential pension funds, and African green assets.
Okay, Kathleen, I will stop you just there because otherwise we're going to overwhelm us slightly with thoughts. So much to think about. So you've set out very clearly from the Africa perspective the needs that we're talking about here and the way that the framework as it exists now doesn't help Africa to meet the sustainability goals.
And it doesn't need just an update. It really needs a complete reset. And I think that if we want to make the case for the value of multilateral system, we need to change the system. And when we need to change the system, it means 2 things. It's not just only about more money, even if there's need for more money, but about better money. I'll take 2 examples. SDR's allocation.
Can I get to Anshula?
But please, if you just allow me to finish. I think we need to change the paradigm itself, which is when we say global multilateral system, it's not global anymore. We need to look at the competition of BRICS, of the Netbank, of other alternate systems. And to be frank, when we talk about global values, they are not global anymore. 2, we need to see that the multilateral system is not anymore about developed countries helping developing countries. We need to shift to a system where we are talking about partners, about addressing together shared challenges. 3, we need to stop to work in silos, sector, and stakeholders.
Okay, thank you very much. Now, plenty, Anshula, to think about there. So let's us take some time to respond on those points that Nathalie made very clearly. So firstly, talking about the need and saying that the existing system, and you've talked about how it's changing, it's evolving, maybe further change is needed. She was saying it's not delivering for Africa, it's not helping them get closer to the sustainability, to the development goals. Do you recognize that? Is that the experience of the World Bank? Is that what motivates you to change? I mean, she's talking about paradigm shift.
You know, International Development Association, or IDA, that is our key institute which serves the countries in Africa. So, the numbers you quoted in terms of the needs, they sort of boggle your mind. So I believe we shouldn't get caught in those numbers because these trillions of dollars are very amorphous. You need to see what we can do on the ground and really deliver. So you talked about energy, you talked about infrastructure. You know, close to 700 million people in Africa today do not have access to energy. You think about growth, you think about development, you think about jobs for the youth. None of these can happen, or even the digital, unless you have energy access. So we are now trying to pick up some of these big issues, identify them, work collectively with partners, including the private sector, to deliver at scale clear targets. So we've announced very recently, I don't know if you got a chance to see this, that the World Bank group, the private sector and the World Bank, IFC, MIGA, all of us will work together with the African Development Bank to deliver energy access to 300 million people over the next 5 to 7 years. 250 million will come from our shop, and 50 million will come from African Development Shop. Can we do this alone from the IDA balance sheet? No, we cannot. It has to be the private sector, it has to be us, it has to be other development banks flowing together. Then, you talked about mitigation versus adaptation. Let me also say this, we also need to recognize what is already working well or doing well. IDA is the largest adaptation financer for low-income countries today. More than 50% of the financing that we do for IDA countries, it goes to adaptation. You're very right. Mitigation is not the challenge. The challenge as we deliver this energy access to 300 million people, to do this in a sustainable manner, through renewable energy, through clean energy. Adaptation is the area which is being tackled as we speak through multiple programs in IDA. The third thing you talked about is the Africa risk. Yes, the risks are high, the perceptions of risk are high. What are we doing about it? We've tried to break down problems and see how we can work towards solving them. So for instance, we have the private sector window in IDA, which over the last, I would say 3 to 5 years, has provided about $5 billion in seed money, which has enabled to mobilize up to $25 billion in private capital financing for African countries. So, these are some of the concrete steps we are taking and trying to find solutions. And above all, let me say this, that IDA is highly concessional. Almost as much as 15 to 20% each year are given out as outright grants. So the effort is not to add to the debt burden of these countries, which the Chancellor spoke about, you mentioned. In fact, there's a rhythm to IDA. The more debt distressed a country gets, the more concessional or grant-like our support becomes. Last year, let me give you one, it's a much smaller number, but we disbursed 20 billion more from IDA than what we received in debt repayments. So we are trying to make sure that we are there for them through positive net flows, working along and again, I just want to repeat this, that we believe in a country-led model. This fragmented aid coming from multiple sources, it's very difficult for the country needs to be in the driver's seat for this.
Sometimes aid organizations might suggest that they want to give thematically. Does that get in the way of that?
I wouldn't say it gets in the way of that. What we are trying to do is work better with these vertical funds. For instance, there are multiple climate funds there. They have their place and they have their role to play. While I agree in some ways, I am a finance person, so it's important for me. IDA is able to multiply donor contribution 3.5 to 4 times, whereas we issue bonds in the capital markets, and that allows us this multiplication. Whereas these vertical funds, they come with 1:1, one inflow, one outflow, but they have a critical role to play. We partner with many of them. Because, in many of the projects that we do, we need grant money, we need partners who have deep knowledge about climate adaptation and mitigation to work alongside us, for instance. So I would say there's a role for everyone, but we need to coordinate better. We need to work better together so that it's not so cumbersome for the recipient countries.
Does that sound like the type of thing you're calling for, Nathalie, or is this not enough of a paradigm shift?
No. Well, yeah, it's quite a lot already, and definitely what's going on with the IDA replenishment is absolutely key. I mean, it's definitely something.
Yeah, IDA 21 is currently under replenishment this year.
Yes.
Big plug for IDA, that's why.
Maybe I would add one thing. When we say we need to work more together, I'm coming back to this multi-stakeholders approach, if I may say so, or change of governance. There is no board, no company board, which would have no independent directors. Currently at the World Bank and IMF, there is no real seat or not enough seat for Africa. I think strengthening Africa's voice, on these institutions is absolutely key, if only because it allows for more ownership about the definition of the solution, and then for more accountability about the implementation of the solution. This is really, and there has been already a lot of progress with more seats for Africa at IMF and World Bank, and African Union getting a seat at the G20. But we need to do more on that.
We heard from Chancellor Scholz, yes, he was talking about this organization about as being one that adds to the globalization of our thinking. And I'm sure that's something that the World Bank and other parts of that infrastructure reflect on often.
Oh, yes. And, you know, like you said, there's always room for improvement, but we have very strong voices from Africa in our board. And particularly if you look at the IDA governance structure, you know, the donors are called IDA deputies, and there are the recipient countries, they're called the borrower representatives. We always meet collectively. Any decision that is taken is a collective decision. So they are a key voice when we decide which are the policy priorities we need to move forward towards what should we devote these resources. And resources are not just financial. It is also about knowledge, the global experience we gain working in different countries, how we can bring good learnings from one country into, you know, solutions for another country. So I think it is actually in some ways I would say IDA is it's a beautiful partnership. It has the countries, and there is a very strong voice for CSOs and think tanks. I'm sure you would be aware, Natalie, we've been extensively engaged with CSOs, think tanks, academicians in this whole evolution process. The Chancellor mentioned the $11 billion, and I would like to use this forum to extend our grateful thanks to Germany for support for the World Bank. You know, they were the first mover, like he said, on the hybrid capital instrument, that is for IBRD, which led to these commitments from 10 other donors, shareholders, and we hope to be able to leverage that to deliver at least $670 billion in additional capacity over 10 years. The fact is that it is, in some ways, both sides, whether it's donors, whether it's recipients, whether it's IBRD or IDA, it is a partnership which is working together. I personally went to, I don't know how many CSO forums for consultation, hearing their voices. And you know, many of these CSOs are the loudest, what should I say, advocates for IDA. They are our partners in this, very much so.
You talked about climate and that being one of the challenges, and we heard from the Chancellor talking about that as well. I mean, what can be done on that front, given that it is maybe more thematic, Anshula? How do you make sure that you're working in a way that tackles that particular challenge?
You know, we are, like you said, we are not focused on one particular challenge. If you think about the global challenges today, not the biggest ones the Chancellor mentioned, but if you just step just below that layer, can you have today health without clean air, clean water, without adequate food security?
They're all linked, yeah.
They are linked, right? Climate is clean air and clean water, clean energy. If you don't have healthy children, can they be well educated? Can the young people in these countries be equipped to do productive jobs? You know, Africa's population is set to double by 2050. And even today, as we currently speak, there are more people, young people, flowing into the job markets than the jobs which are created. This creates a very high-risk, unstable situation. You need to find good, productive jobs for the young people. And how can you do that? It has to be, again, then you come back to energy access, infrastructure, digital. You know, these things are also important for countries in Africa. It's not just about climate adaptation.
Organizations such as Anshula's, the World Bank, well, we just heard you arguing that, you know, with IDA, you're able to pool funds and benefit from a strong credit rating and leverage that funding to allow it to deliver more on the ground. Are there arguments, I mean, more collaboration with organizations like the World Bank to help Africa? Where would you like to see them put that kind of power to work?
I think it's absolutely key indeed to join forces and to break silos between various stakeholders. I think, once again, the multilateral architecture is not only about a meeting of institutions or even countries, but they must include local governance. Cities, for example, they're absolutely key to bring solutions and ideas to all these challenges. Civil society, think tanks, private sector, indeed. It's only if we join forces that I think we will be able to bring more efficient solutions. Because here again, as you just said, the interactivity between all challenges is obvious. Climate and health, conflict and development, peace, security and development, energy and health. And it's only by having this new, because it's a new interactive approach, that we can make progress. So what's happening now, it's really good. It's really...
So making progress. And what is the role of China? Because on that front, we've seen the common framework put in place and some attempts to collaborate there as well.
I mean, if we take the debt issue, we won't solve it without China coming in. But I think, to be frank, that there we must consider between everything must come from one place only, or if we want, or to what extent we are able to make place for alternative solutions, for alternative systems, or to collaborate between different systems. I was talking about BRICS a bit earlier. We need to consider BRICS, what the BRICS system is doing, which is basically looking at the demand before defining the supply in many ways. And this is why it's so attractive to so many countries from the global south. So I wouldn't say that the solution is to bring China by all means into what too many people still call at the global multilateral system. Or if we do that, we need also to take into account different systems, different values. I think this is important because otherwise we won't be efficient. We will just continue to define the supply without considering, one, the demand, and two, the competition. We need to have a business approach when we are trying to solve challenges. What is the demand? What is the competition? What are our competitive advantage in the supply that we are proposing, offering?
And Sheila, China, a big player in Africa and in probably in many parts of the world that you operate. So you must be used to these days some level of, well, we talked about collaboration and bringing all players together, calling on them to do what they can on some of these challenges.
Oh, yes, absolutely. And I agree with you. You know, the common framework, there is a lot of room for improvement there. And IMF and the World Bank and other players are trying to identify and pick up those pieces which need improvement. But let me also share about, and you must be aware about this, we have the Global Sovereign Debt Roundtable, which was launched last year, and which the G20 presidency, IMF, and World Bank co-chair, and where you have players which include China sitting around the table, talking about problems and trying to find solutions. You know, this is not something that you can have an across-the-table solution, but from the World Bank, what we try to do, for instance, the 4 countries which are under the common framework currently, over the last 3 years, I would say we definitely remain engaged in the process. We work together with IMF. Over the last 3 years, I would say nearly $12 billion resources have been delivered from the World Bank to these 4 countries. And I would say as much as half of those would be outright grant terms. So we are, also a little bit of a pragmatic player in the sense and ongoing how we can support the process and help these countries sustain themselves as they work through these very difficult, restructuring exercise. But we have better hopes of this GSDR, the Global Sovereign Debt Roundtable, where we do try to share information, for instance, early enough so that everybody is on the same page, where the private creditors are there, where the official in China is very much a part of this roundtable.
Where does that leave your thoughts, Nathalie, as we come to the end of the conversation about the needs in Africa and whether the framework that we have, the global architecture, whether it can be adapted to meet? Because when we started this conversation, you were calling for paradigm shift. And I wonder if you see that there is appetite for that.
Yeah, I think there is, if only because there is not only a need, but also an interest. I mean, I think that more and more all stakeholders are seeing that this is not a question of moral duty, once again, to help developing countries, but because it's the only way to be able to address properly and efficiently what are today shared challenges. It's not, once again, the developed countries looking to the developing countries and trying to help. It's really getting together around the same table at the same level on par to solve shared challenges. Yeah, so I think we're getting there, and I think that what the Chancellor just said was absolutely going in that direction. I mean, it's great. It's really there's still a lot to do, but it's fine. We are getting there.
Okay, thank you both very much. Thank you to Nathalie Delapalme, CEO of the Mo Ibrahim Foundation, and to Anshula Kant from the World Bank, Managing Director and CFO. Thank you both very much. Thank you. I'll stay here. So, ladies and gentlemen, we now move on to the next part of our programme. I'm told that the Minister of Finance, Christian Lindner, unfortunately was not able to be here at very last minute notice. But I can tell you that instead we are going to be joined by State Secretary Heiko Thoms, who has some thoughts to bring us on this subject. And so we'll just take a moment to reset the set, perhaps, as everybody gets to their places. State Secretary. Hello. Hello, I'm Anna Edwards from Bloomberg News. This is such a last-minute change that we haven't actually had the chance to say hello. So it's very nice to meet you, and thank you so much.
It's great to be here, and I want to apologize for not being Christian Lindner. I didn't think I was ever going to say that, but I know that you would have preferred seeing him here, and I only knew 15 minutes ago that I was going to be here, so please bear with me.
Okay, yes, well, bear with both of us, because we're sort of rehearsing this in front of you all. So thank you very much for being with us, State Secretary. So what I was planning to do with the Minister of Finance was to talk about three things, so I'll run those past you, and so the audience knows where we're going in this short conversation. Financing development goals, the fiscal trade-offs that are involved in doing that, because it's all very well to have the high aspirations that everybody has for these development goals, but where the money comes from is an important matter there. And the international debt architecture, we've been talking about that a little bit already this morning, and so getting your thoughts from the German perspective on where we are there. So let's start with the development goals. We heard from the Chancellor about climate and the progress that's being made there, but the big challenges that still lie ahead. It seems that from the German political class, and actually from lots of Western governments, it's difficult to take people with you on the climate journey. And sometimes we see backsliding on climate policy here and in other countries as well. Why do you think it is so difficult to make the case for climate policies with your electorate?
Well, let me first say something so that you see where I'm coming from. So at the Ministry of Finance, we do care about the Sustainable Development Goals quite a bit. I personally care, and I don't know who else was in the room when the SDGs were actually adopted. I was there, because that was my former field of expertise when I was working at the UN. So it's a priority for us. It's a priority for the German government as a whole. It's a priority for us. But of course, there are trade-offs, and the situation has not become easier. In particular, I mean, I don't need to talk about the pandemic. I told myself I will stop talking about the pandemic, but the Russian war of aggression is a factor. And of course, when I talk about trade-offs, military budgets are, of course, now on the agenda, much more than they were before. And this is a point I'm making also at our G20 meetings. I'm a German finance deputy for the G20, and we have to make clear each and every time that, of course, we would prefer spending this money on something else. Germany has contributed bilaterally alone more than 30 billion euros for Ukraine. Imagine what we could have done with that money in other parts of the world for the SDGs. Of course, we would prefer that, but it's something we simply have to be aware of. That's the reality these days. But that doesn't mean we're not committed to implementing the SDGs. It just hasn't become any easier.
But as politicians, do you have a duty to do more, to take people with you, to explain to people why change is needed around climate, and to explain to them where the funding comes from? Because that is also complicated.
Absolutely, and we're trying to do this. It's just not getting any easier, but still. As much as we would like to do even more than we're doing, I'd still like to make the point what Germany is already doing for the SDGs. We are a little bit proud of the fact that for the moment and for some factors having to do with the war in Ukraine as well, that we are now the only G7 countries who's actually sticking to its 0.7% ODA objective. That's quite something. And even if this is going to go down a little bit, we'll still be probably the one country that's contributing the most to ODA in the G7 group. Also, when it comes to climate finance, we have a fair burden to share of around about 6 billion euros for the 100 billion euros in climate finance. We're doing 8 to 10. So it's something that we should also mention, that it's not doing nothing. Okay. We just like to do more.
So you have a record. You would like to point out what is being done, I understand. You've mentioned defence spending. The Chancellor earlier talked about there being no peace. Well, there cannot be sustainable development if there is no peace. And so linking defence to what we're talking about here and putting it on the agenda. You have a special off-budget fund in Germany, 100 billion euros, but that gets used up by the end of the year. How does Germany stick to its commitments on NATO, let alone the other things it wants to spend money on, given these funding constraints?
Well, in general terms, I'm personally of the conviction that big issues that humanity has to take care of will always find their own political majorities. And this will be the case here, but that's a very generic answer. The concrete answer is that our budget, defense budget, is financed through, until the year 27 at least, through the 100 billion fund. And as of 2028, we will have to find other solutions, but the government as a whole and the Minister of Finance is completely committed to doing that, and I think it can be done. But of course, it means reprioritizing some things we are doing now. But my analysis would be also maybe a bit more general. Look, we have an economy in Germany which is more than 4 billion euros. We have a state quota, so percentage of government spending to GDP of around about 50%. That means government spending is 2 billion euros a year. That we can't find the space to finance our assistance to Ukraine and what we need to do for the SDGs. That's simply impossible for me to believe.
Okay, billions and trillions to talk about this morning then. Let me ask you about the role of private funds.
I should have said trillions, of course.
I thought that might be the case. Let me ask you about the role of private players here then, because we've talked about public funds to fix these development goals, but Chancellor Scholz was talking to us about the need for private players. What's he referencing? We need the private sector to do more on these goals.
Well, I've been a bit late here because I come from a meeting with Bill Gates. That's, of course, one answer.
Who will be here later.
But that's not the answer I want to give.
Yes.
No, but I mean, clearly, public money will simply not be enough to achieve all the objectives that we would like to achieve. When it comes to climate finance, when it comes to the SDGs, we need to leverage the public money, or we probably need to leverage the private money with public money. And of course, some of the things are already happening. I believe you had just had a panel here with representatives from the World Bank.
Yes.
For instance, we have contributed new hybrid capital to the World Bank. We were the first to do so. That's money that can be leveraged within the World Bank and reach up to 3 billion. But what we need to do, for instance, in order to mobilize more private funds is, for instance, to think more about blended finance. So, or first risk tranches that we can take with public money. These are answers, but there will be many answers to doing that. We need to mobilize more private capital, and I believe it also has to do a lot with governments in the recipient countries. We, of course, need to improve the structures that are there so that investing there also, in the end, is worth the while.
Okay, and another thing that could be thought about is borrowing more, of course, by the countries that are able to do so, and that brings me to this conversation here in Germany. Of course, the debt limit much talked about, but there are many economists who would argue that it should be suspended for a period. Are you open to that conversation?
Well, even if I were, I think it's a debate we don't need to have, because there is no political majority in Parliament to do that. It's a simple fact. So if you want to change the debt brake, you would need a 2/3 majority, which is simply not there. And I'm personally convinced I was the one who had to negotiate the new fiscal rules on the European level, so the Economic Governance Review, Stability and Growth Pact. So I've had my share of talking about debt rules from a European perspective. I believe it's extremely important that we have this anchor, because our situation is very different from that of any other area in the world. In Europe, we need this core that we are providing in Germany,
yes,
to keep the euro stable. If we didn't do that, we would be in a much worse situation.
Okay, and something else that some people think could affect the euro is use of Russian funds, frozen Russian assets. Have you received any details from the US about any proposal to use those funds? Is that something that you're open to, if you see the detail there? Because I know there's been resistance in Germany to use those funds to solve some of these polycrises we're talking about today.
No, we are very open to do just that. You need to distinguish between the Russian assets as such, the money which is frozen, and using the proceeds that can be derived from those assets. And when it comes to the proceeds, we're actually very far advanced on the European level to use them. Yes, there's lots of agreement on that.
Yeah. Yes.
And then we have seen American proposals to use those proceeds maybe in an even better way. We are very open to discussing that, but the devil is in the detail, of course, in these things. And if we see something that's worked out on a more detailed level even, then of course that's something that we will consider. We're actually actively considering right now.
Using the assets themselves, or just the profits?
No. Finding a different solution for the proceeds.
So the assets themselves still not being considered?
No, this is something that we will not touch.
Okay, that's the German perspective. Can I move on to the third topic then, international debt architecture? We talked a little in our last conversation about the common framework that is now in place to bring China around the table with the Paris Club and to allow those conversations around global debt to carry on. It's not moving fast enough, a lot of people say. Is that the German perspective? I think that Christian Lindner, the finance minister, has talked about that.
Well, the common framework, the G20 common framework, is the direction to go in our view at this point. It's not perfect, and it's certainly not moving fast enough. But there's also quite considerable progress. When you look at some countries in Africa where we have managed to restructure that within the common framework, these are success stories in our view. And when you look at the period of time spent between the IMF program and the actual restructuring, the time spent is shortening each and every time, which means that is something that the common framework has brought about. So we're quite positive about what we're seeing, but that doesn't mean it can't be improved. And you have mentioned China, of course. It is sometimes not an easy debate with the Chinese colleagues, although they're opening up to doing more in that framework as well.
We were just having another conversation with the Mo Ibrahim Foundation, giving the African perspective on some of these issues and the way that the financial architecture is set up. And the argument we were hearing there is that a paradigm shift is needed, that there needs to be more room for African voices and other Global South voices to be at the table during these conversations. Would you like to see more of that?
Yes, and we're actively working on it. You know that in general terms, in the G20, we have now included the African Union, which is a very positive step in our view. Also, within the G20, we have the Compact with Africa. I'm personally the co-chair of the Africa Advisory Group, where we work with a group of African countries on structural reforms. And these are all small, not very visible, but still important success stories.
Okay. State Secretary Heiko Thoms, thank you very much for being with us at short notice. Thank you.